It is not always easy to know whether a mistake has been made. And part of my argument this morning will be that in the most important and consequential situations, it's extremely difficult to know whether a mistake has been made, and that sometimes it's a mistake to try. We know about mistakes in simple tasks. We know what it is a mistake when we're driving, when we're reading, when we're spelling. There is a correct answer, there is a correct way of doing things, and if you don't do that thing, you have made a mistake, and people in general learn from these mistakes. There are many skills that more or less quickly we're capable to acquire. That requires a stable environment, an environment with rules, where the same actions are followed by the same consequences, and under those circumstances, animals in general and humans in particular are capable of learning the rules. The circumstances are important because they involve feedback. In order to make a mistake and to learn from the mistake, you need for the feedback to be relatively quick and to be unequivocal. You have to know what was the action that led to the actual mistake. Under these conditions, sometimes real expertise can develop. This is how chess masters become masters. They become masters by making mistakes and by seeing the consequences of their mistakes. And eventually they get to the point where they don't make mistakes anymore, at least not crude ones, and where just about everything that comes to their mind is a good move. Now, the world isn't always like that. The world is a very uncertain place. And in most complex and interesting situations, there is considerable uncertainty about the consequences of an action. It is impossible to tell in advance. And not only if it is impossible in advance, then, and this is very important, it's also impossible to tell after the fact. Decisions are gambles. And what that means is that a good decision, the best possible decision, can have bad outcomes, and a bad decision could have good outcomes. In such a world, identifying mistakes is actually quite difficult. I'll give you a few examples. You pick stocks. There are people who pick stocks professionally. It turns out this is a task that cannot be done well. Stocks, in effect, are random. They are unpredictable. And therefore, in some deep sense, people who do this are not making mistakes. They just live in a world that is very complicated. Political forecasting, long-term, has very much the same character. It turns out that long-term political forecasting is essentially impossible. And it's impossible because the world is too complicated. And so it's hard to speak about mistakes when you live in a world like that. Where forecasting is impossible, where uncertainty is considerable, all we have to go by are outcomes. And unfortunately, our intuitive judgment of actions and performances is based primarily on outcomes. And we intuitively tend to think that if the outcome was good, then the decision was good. If the outcome was bad, then the decision was bad. This is simply not true when decisions are gambles. You cannot infer with so much certainty that a bad decision was a mistake. Now, in a world of uncertainty, of considerable uncertainty, many perverse things can happen. In particular, reputations can be built, for good or for bad, on the basis of what is essentially a random sequence of events. And anybody who has tried to invest in the stock market or in mutual funds, they report their results for the last 4 or 5 years, and in general the results have been very good, otherwise they wouldn't be talking about it. But those results are purely chance, or almost entirely chance. It is in fact impossible to tell whether a fund is a good fund or not a good fund on the basis of its performance in 5 years. There are just too many funds, and it's like tossing a coin many, many times. It can show heads 10 times if you go long enough. it's not only in the domain of funds, it's also in other domains, for example, in the military domain, where you can imagine generals, one of them being willing to take more risks than another, and being willing to take risks that are in fact unacceptable, that he shouldn't take. But it's possible to gamble several times and to be successful. And when a general takes too many risks several times and is successful several times in a row, we do not say that this person was lucky. We say he's a military genius. We say he has flair. We say other people who discouraged him from taking that risk are mediocre and cowardly. This is the way we think. We judge by outcomes. And judging by outcomes is actually a very severe problem. Judging by outcomes is closely related to a bias, a cognitive bias that has been studied extensively, and this is the bias of hindsight, that once an event has occurred, we think we understand it. And there are few worse things than hindsight, because hindsight not only causes us to make unjust decisions about people who have had good outcomes or bad outcomes, hindsight perpetuates the illusion that the world is understandable, and accepting the fact that in many respects the world is not understandable is actually essential to have a realistic view of the conditions under which we live. Because of hindsight, people learn too much from outcomes, because then you see, it looks obvious to you what the situation was, and you cannot understand why what is obvious to you now was not obvious to the people ahead of time. This is truly a very bad thing. We can see it, for example, now in the financial crisis. There are some people who say that they knew that the crisis was going to appear, and we look up to these people. We think they're geniuses. But in fact, they didn't know that the crisis was going to happen. They thought a crisis was going to happen. And at the same time as they thought that, there were equally well-informed people thinking the opposite, that a crisis would not happen. After the fact, in hindsight, some people are said to have thought correctly, and others are said to have made a mistake. And that is an error. We shouldn't be thinking that way. The world in general makes too much sense to us. We do not admit the level of uncertainty, the level of unknowability in the circumstances under which we operate. Experience, which we think of so much, doesn't always generate expertise. Experience generates expertise in a regular world. When the world is irregular and unpredictable, experience generates expertise sometimes in irrelevant matters. That is, people who have lived long in the financial world know all sorts of things that other people don't know. But it doesn't enable them to pick stocks better than other people, because that, in fact, turns out to be unknowable. So, in a world that has so much uncertainty, and where detecting mistakes is so difficult, and rewarding good outcomes and punishing bad outcomes is actually costly, because by punishing bad outcomes of good decisions, we remove from the decision-making people who should be there, who should have remained there. What is the alternative? Well, there is, I think, an alternative. And the alternative is not to focus on outcomes, but to focus on process. That is, decision-making is an activity. There is some thinking that goes on, there are some considerations that are laid out. We do decision-making in large organizations, consequential decisions are made fairly slowly. And you can evaluate the quality of decision-making. One aspect of life that I find quite bewildering is the absence of what I would call quality control on the process of decision-making. Any institution, any government is actually a factory for generating decisions. And factories have quality control processes. We don't, and we should. And quality control of decision-making is in fact possible, because the errors that people make, and errors are knowable in advance. The only errors that can be defined with certainty are knowable in advance. There are considerations that people should use that they don't use. There is information that they rely on that they shouldn't rely on. There is a lot that we know about the errors that people make, and that we should be able to know in real time by observing decision-making. We don't do that. There is actually very little ongoing critique of decision-making. In order to learn from mistakes, in order to learn from bad processes of decision-making, there is another thing that should be done, and this is keeping track. Keeping track of the considerations, keeping track of the deliberations, looking at the alternatives that were considered and rejected before a decision was made. And for some reason, this is very difficult to achieve in organizations. There is enormous resistance in organizations to improving the rationality of their decision processes. And the resistance comes from the fact that people in authority do not like anybody looking over their shoulder. And that inevitably, once you have a process that looks for mistakes and identifies mistakes in real time, then there is that threat to the decision makers that somebody is looking over their shoulders and that later they will be blamed. One of the possibilities, and it exists in some places, and I think it should be considered widely, more widely, is for leaders to have coaches. Now, the idea of a tennis coach doesn't play tennis better than the athlete that he or she is coaching. But he can look objectively at the performance of the athlete and make comments and suggestions. It's very difficult, I suppose, for a leader to find somebody who will perform that function. But I have known in some organizations in which, in fact, leaders have sufficient confidence to be able to take somebody whom they trust and who will be able to report on the quality of the thinking, of the decision-making as it is going on, without waiting for the outcomes to determine, or in fact, as I've said, not to determine whether a mistake was made. Thank you.